3D Printing Today, show number 425, Polypropylene, Pie Opinions, the Gaming Market.
Welcome back to 3D Printing Today, the podcast about all aspects of 3D printing. Hobby, professional, industrial, it does not matter. We cover it all. My name's Andy Cohen, and I'm here with Mr. Whitney Potter.
How you doing, Andy?
Doing pretty good. You see the news about Materialize?
Yeah.
So Materialize is a service company where basically they print for folks and they make software for turnkey manufacturing, I assume. And they're out of Belgium. And how have they been doing?
Until recently, at least, their stock price has been kind of going down, and not just. Let me just pull up the.
Oh, I mean, is this how lately? Because the situation in Europe, Eastern Europe, is bringing everybody down.
Right, but they've basically, for the last year, their stock's been, they lost about half value over the last year. And yeah, it's been pretty evenly spread over the whole year. So it's not we can't blame the current market conditions.
But that can explain why they went out of their way to make this big announcement. And the announcement was that they've got a significant revenue increase for the fiscal year of 2021. They're claiming a 21% increase in profits. Well, no. That's revenue increase, not necessarily profits. I don't know what the percentage is of profits.
Yeah.
But the headline is Materialize reports FY 2021 profit, 21% revenue increase. That's out of 3dprint.com. Now, that doesn't mean they made more money. That just means that more money went through them. Although they do say that their profits were not bad. I'm trying to find it. It's in there. Growth of up to 10% of the previous quarter. Yeah, it's in there. But I'm hoping they're okay because they're a bit of a bellwether for Europe. And if you read this article, as you get deeper into the article, you see that they've got a bit of a challenge. Unfortunately, they've got a significant number of staff that work in Ukraine. They call them collaborators. Maybe they're contract hires, I'm not sure. But 430 of them are in Ukraine, and they're active in engineering and software and all sorts of other staff functions. And in the article, they're saying that they're working to find them both within and outside of Ukraine, places to work so they could be safe.
Well, that's a good plan. I say it could be worse. They could have huge amounts of hardware invested in Ukraine as well.
Yeah, that's true.
It would be harder to get out than the people. The people are obviously more important, but they're a lot more mobile too. So.
Yeah, probably a good idea for all of us to keep an eye on Materialize and hope the best for them because they're a bellwether company for Europe for 3D printing.
Yep. The market hasn't really responded greatly to this news. They're up almost 6% on the day, but for the last week, that brings them up to about even over the last week. So it's
and just you guys out there, we're recording this March 9th. So by the time you guys get this,
it's old news.
Yeah, it'll be April.
Right, our news is always old news.
Yeah, sorry about that. We're not timely with news, which is why we focus more on less topical stuff, I guess. Speaking of less topical stuff, that's probably not a good connotation. What's coming up on our show this week?
Let's see. We start out talking about printing with polypropylene.
We kind of going to get a lot of you out there angry because we're going to spew our opinions on the Raspberry Pi as use for a server board.
And then we're going to talk about the gaming market.
Let's do it. Okay, here, check out this filament. Open up the bag and look at it. That's PP, which is short for polypropylene.
Wow.
We purchased a spool from Form Futura. Now, the first thing that you should recognize as you hold the filament in your hand, the strand, is that it's pretty flexible.
It's very, very flexible. It's like nylon flexible, but it may be even softer.
I would say it's in between nylon and TPU. And I would say that it can rate as a flexible in thinner applications
for like living hinges and that sort of thing. It has there's kind of a funny texture. At first I thought it was like how like you get a texture from the spur gear, from the drive gears if you've pulled it out, but it's actually further up. Like all of the material has that same kind of,
it's an interesting texture,
weird texture to it.
Yeah. So
polypropylene.
Polypropylene. Now one of our acquaintances on our Google group, our forum, Randy Zimmer, posted some experiences that he had with Form Futura's PP. Gosh, I don't think that's a very good acronym. PP. Anyway, and so using his suggestions and going out in the garage, basically I set my temps to 230. I set my bed to about 60. Actually, I upped it to 65 because it was really cold in the garage, and I watched how things were printing. My first experiences were fail. The stuff would not stick. It doesn't stick very well.
What kind of just your standard glass and
standard
hairspray?
Glass with Aquanet, not hairspray. Aquanet. We never say hairspray. Always say Aquanet because it's not hairspray. Any hairspray. Yeah, it's not any hairspray. It's the liquid vinyl in Aquanet.
Yeah,
and it stuck, but didn't stuck well enough.
And was it heated appropriately?
65C. So I added some surface material. I added something like a helper discs, and I added skirts to the edges, and I was able to get it to grip. I was able to get it to grip on, and I started noticing my starting speeds on this machine are always 100 millimeters per second for print speed. Travel speed is usually 150 to 200 starting, and I go up from there because this is a relatively nice Core XY linear guide machine, and things were not printing well. The first thing I noticed was as I went across gaps, say a top over of infill, the stuff kind of didn't like moving
bridge
uniformly. Like it didn't. It would kind of stick and hold itself and then release and hold itself and then release. And that created kind of little bumps, little gaps in the roofs or tops of enclosures. And I noticed other things too that were kind of reminiscent of TPU, where things were just not they just could not grab long enough. So first thing I do is just slow it all down.
Right.
I went down to 40 millimeters per second, and things started getting better, which makes sense. Things will always print nicer when you go slow.
Right.
And then I looked carefully at my previews, and I compare in my previews where I'm seeing the problems and the gaps and stuff. And sure enough, it's places right after travels. So I slowed down traveling, and that helped. And what was the last thing I did?
So it was having problems restarting?
It was having problems like when it goes across a gap and then attaches to the previously extruded area, it may not fuse optimally.
So you have too much retraction?
I don't think. I was watching it. That's the ideal with 3D printing. You got to get your nose down in there and watch it.
See exactly what's going on.
So I slowed it down, but the last thing I did, which really nailed it, was extrusion width. The clue to extrusion width issue was looking at my previews. I'm seeing the problems, and I looked at my previews as to where the problems were, and I can see I had gaps between the lines of the extrusions, or they were too close together. So the extrusion width was not optimal for that object. So I lowered the extrusion width from, I think it was 4.85, which was the automatic extrusion width for Simplify 3D,
Right.
to manually setting it to 0.3 Was it 0.3 or is it yeah, 0.3, and that gave me the optimal positioning of the lines on the preview, and that nailed the problem.
Right.
And so if you look at this print, which is a coin tube, this is a tube for quarters. You could see the base on the bed held, and that was by adding skirts. And I got a nice uniform, even print on the body, and it looks nice and clean.
Yeah.
And everything worked fine.
The top is a little bit funky, but
yeah,
it's very flexy.
It's flexy.
I mean, it feels like kind of almost like nylon.
It's softer and more flexible than 910. I gotta say it prints a lot like 910. It prints a lot like nylon. It feels like nylon, prints like nylon. However, it's at 230C, so it doesn't have the same properties in terms of durability and heat capabilities as nylon.
Right.
It's about the same price as nylon. It's not cheaper, not more expensive. The question is would I swap out using PP over 910? And the answer would be a definite no. Definitely no.
This is harder to print well.
It's harder to print well because each different geometry I pick, I'm going to go through that same kind of process of having to fix it. Whereas in 910, I've got it set to one thing and everything works fine. I never have to change my task flow. 910 is the most durable material I've got, as rigid as I could get. So I don't know. I'm looking at PP and I'm thinking, why?
Why?
Why should I bother? I don't have any use cases that only PP can satisfy.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of it's widely used in food packaging, like yogurt containers are mostly, that sort of plastic tub. If they're not clear, the white ones are mostly polypropylene.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to make those.
Yeah, no, I'm just trying to think of like what engineering properties polypropylene has that make it more desirable than nylon.
I really
I think
don't
it's
know.
cheaper than nylon if you're buying it in like bulk.
Yeah,
I don't, but not for if you're buying filaments.
The Form Futura stuff was a little bit on the expensive side, about the same kind of price as the 910 that I buy. Yeah. I don't buy my 910 directly from Talman any longer. I buy it from other sources. Although, Talman's probably the optimal supplier. They get a little pricey when you buy direct from them. So polypropylene, why? Not as bad as experience as we had with PVB.
Well,
that was pretty bad.
Yeah.
We've had worse. But I got to say, why go off into these, not very well used materials when PETG and HTPLA, PETG, nylon TPU?
Yep.
Why go elsewhere?
Well, unless there's some specific, chemical resistance or thermal properties, or unless there's some real specific need for it, it doesn't really make sense to get into the esoteric stuff.
Yeah. Oh, well. We've talked a lot about our opinions about the Raspberry Pi and using it for multiple things related to 3D printing. I used to sell them in my shop, and I've got lots of them in a box. And lately, I went out and purchased power supplies sold explicitly for the purpose of using with a Raspberry Pi. And these
they work
are
better?
Oh boy, big difference. Yeah. When you use a Raspberry Pi as a desktop computer, you can use a run-of-the-mill 5-volt USB charger. You could probably get away with that. But when you use a Raspberry Pi with Wi-Fi to, say, use it with Octoprint, that's not going to work. And so that's how I was using them. And for more than a year, I had it as a server for my shop, and it worked great. And I used an off-the-shelf 2.1 amp charger. Not a problem at all. and it ran for about a year and a half. And then I had one in my garage that I used with a 2.1 USB charger, 2.1 amp USB charger. And it ran for about a year without any problems at all. And then over time, it didn't work any longer. Though first the Wi-Fi stopped working. It would work fine when I brought it into my office and ran it by the router. It worked great. But as soon as I got it out into the garage with the other printers, no, it stopped functioning. Then when I got this new power supply that comes from the source that sells the Raspberry Pis, it actually has a switch on the cable. Surprisingly, now it works perfectly fine. And I dug into it deeper, and there are time peak moments where it draws more current than a 2.1 amp iPad charger can provide. So it's like 2.5 amp is the need for this kind of heavy use application of the Raspberry Pi.
Just enough out of spec to cause problems occasionally.
Yes. So I put it on a version 1.3, I think, and it works optimally now. And it's the version that has the Wi-Fi on board, not a separate dongle. I gave my version 1.0 board away that has to have the Wi-Fi dongle in the USB port. That actually draws even more power from what I understand. I went out and bought the latest version, Raspberry Pi 4. I was able to get it and snag it before supplies got really tight because of the pandemic. I also got the Raspberry Zero, I think it's called, a really small one. And we'll be using those and experimenting with those in the future. But my 1.3 is now chugging away optimally without any issues at all with this new power supply. So Raspberry Pi for Octoprint, it works pretty darn good with the optimal power supply. I'm getting great reliability with a great piece of software. Octoprint is excellent, and it has plugins galore, works brilliantly. You get a really good task flow working with the Raspberry Pi. It's excellent. Great stuff.
Yeah, for me, I found Octoprint worked really well once I hardwired it into my Ethernet.
Yeah.
But I was having a lot of problems with the Wi-Fi on it. But once I hardwired it in the Ethernet, it worked beautifully.
Yeah. So let's make it perfectly clear here that we really, really like using Raspberry Pis. Now, you can use a Raspberry Pi as the primary slicing engine using the Clipper firmware. When you're using a Raspberry Pi in that manner, though, that use case is way beyond just using it for Octoprint. Because with Octoprint, every time you... Well, I don't know. Maybe it's the problem with Octoprint, too. It depends upon how heavy you use it. When you send a file to Octoprint, it's saving it on the SD card that's on that Raspberry Pi. So you're writing to it. And as I recall, there are limits to how much you can read and write from an SD card.
Yeah, it's interesting. We got a email from a listener named AJ Griggs who points out a lot of the problems with Raspberry Pis and why we use them the way we do. And he points out that they're using basically a flash card, and there's basically a limit to the number of times that you can read and write, or write at least, to a flash memory before it fails.
And that would explain the failures at the shop, because my staff would be sending files on a daily basis, 2 or 3 at a time.
Using the flash cards.
Using the flash cards. Flash cards are constantly getting written to and erased, written to and erased.
Yeah. So you'll need to replace those periodically.
But there's a more interesting statement that this listener made.
The other thing that's interesting is that he points out that Linux is not a real-time OS. That means that when you tell a Linux machine to do something, there's no guarantee exactly when it's going to do it.
Right.
Versus something like a microcontroller, like an Arduino-based system, or anything that's been come after that, where basically you are in control of the process and everything is going through just the loop that you've written. And so if you are running machine control on it, you have a pretty good idea that machine control is going to be happening at, the cycle rate that you've set it up at. Whereas with something more complex like Linux running on Raspberry Pi, it could have, an interrupt come in and say, hey, you got to check and see if there's any new available Wi-Fi networks or something. Mm-hmm. All these things that our computers do in the background that we don't notice because we're not that sensitive to what the computer is actually doing until something goes really wrong.
Right.
So the idea about that using a Raspberry Pi is just not going to work for machine control directly, because you can't control exactly where that computing power is going, I think is to summarize what he was saying.
Yeah, it's Linux, and it's a Unix. That's the way Unix works. It's an extremely deep nested batch of C-based processes.
Right.
It's very complicated. I'll never forget working with Unix years and years ago, what it was like. And Linux is still Unix. Now, but that doesn't mean you can't use it that way. But what it does mean is that you need something in that system that's the traffic cop. And that part gives you at least some semblance of real-time functionality. Yeah. And there are extensions for Linux that are real-time, but even those, there's some lack of determinism. Or I shouldn't say there's not a complete lack of determinism, but there are times when, unless all aspects of what you're using it for are completely controlled, it's hard to know that exactly what's happening per each cycle of the clock.
Right.
Now, the way they get around that is, and in particular, a good example of that is Clipper. The way Clipper's being used is the Linux part churns away and spits its data out someplace where it gets stored, and in that storing, that's the traffic cop to where the data goes. And
the actual machine control is still being done on a microcontroller.
Right, and we've gotten comments from listeners who say, yeah, the MCU and the controller board will do that. Maybe. I don't really know that. In all the documentation, I'm not seeing that. What I am seeing is you get the same buffering that you get with the regular G code going to the MCU and that controller board. I don't see that traffic cop happening. But then the argument comes back was, well, maybe you don't need it if you're moving fast enough. You don't have to worry about it. And that may very well be the case. But the real question I then have is, so what?
Right.
I mean, okay, if it only seems to matter when you're pinching pennies, if you want to get the least expensive machine you can possibly get with the most performance, then you go that way. But if cost is not an issue, probably go a different way.
Sure.
But we're not going to get into that.
Yeah. So AJ had a couple of interesting other thoughts on there. He suggests that using a Pi 4, because it will boot from a USB source, that rather than using a flash drive to do your storage, you could put like an SSD on there just with a USB interface,
which is a solid state hard drive,
right?
Basically,
and then basically you've got the the reliability and storage that you would on pretty much every modern laptop.
Yeah.
And you'd be kind of getting around all of those issues, which makes a lot of sense.
But why not use a modern laptop?
Well, you could do that too. It's all a matter of
why not
what you're trying to accomplish.
Not put the management part of what you're doing on a laptop, and then have that, and then you flash the MCU, flash the controller board so that it talks directly to the MCU. Why do you have to go through Raspberry Pi? We all have computers. We all have Windows and Mac computers.
Yeah,
to begin with,
and there's nothing you can do on a Pi
or how would you be slicing your object anyway?
Right.
How would you be making your object or downloading your object if you don't have some kind of a computing device to begin with?
Right. A lot of it has to do with, I think, that it was developed, Clipper was developed on a Raspberry Pi and developed in Linux, and the number of people who have Linux running laptops is kind of minuscule. Not that you couldn't install a dual boot partition or something if you wanted to, but that's well beyond what most people want to do.
Yeah, well, you could just swap out the SD card and do a different boot on your Pi. And
I'm not talking about doing it on a Pi. I'm talking about doing a different boot on your laptop.
Oh, on your laptop.
Right, because if Pi is running in Linux.
But if you're we've got multi-core laptops.
Well, sure. And there's ways that you can wrap Linux and make it run under Windows.
You could have Clipper. You should be able to have Clipper running as an app.
Sure.
And that app talks through the laptop because it's a non-deterministic process anyway.
Yep.
I don't know.
It's just not how the developers developed it.
Yeah, they developed it, I guess, to pinch pennies to get it as inexpensive as possible, which means a Raspberry Pi. And hey, Raspberry Pis are not that inexpensive. A Pi 4 is not that cheap if you can get them.
Cheaper than a laptop.
Yeah. But think about it. If you get yourself a dual-core, an inexpensive dual-core laptop used,
sure,
probably cheaper in the end.
Oh, yeah.
But we'll see. Anyway, that's just our opinions. I'm sure there are folks out there that have their strong opinions, and you're welcome to voice them on our Google group. We do accept them, and we do appreciate
Sure,
them.
and thanks to AJ Griggs for chiming in with his wisdom on the subject.
Yeah. So we've talked about a number of different businesses that tie into home 3D printing. There was one on printing remote control airplanes, one on printing these large remote control Jeeps and four-wheel drive vehicles. There's the artist that does his sculptures. There's the guy that designs toys. But we have never really talked about what is probably one of the largest home 3D printing, how do I say this, file selling? It's basically, the model is you add value by doing a design, and you sell your design as an STL file or an equivalent file for the purchaser to print on their 3D printer. That's the business model.
Sure.
And the probably one of the largest markets of all of them today we have not really talked about, and it's time for us to start talking about it, and that's the gaming market.
So tabletop gaming.
Tabletop gaming.
Yeah.
There's a couple of games, probably the most popular ones is the Settlers of Catan and Warhammer. Now, there are dozens and dozens of other games out there, but these are the ones that seem to be the ones that percolated up to the top, to be the most sold, the most played. And they use little tiny plastic figures, a lot of them. The Settlers of Catan have small parts with like areas. The map itself is a thing.
It's the one with the hexagons.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And there's many different variations of the game. And Warhammer is, in my opinion, and if you're a gamer out there, please email us, educate us, because I'm trying to learn about it. I'm going to be going to the gaming store in our town and talking to folks about it. But in my experience and from what I've seen, Warhammer represents a method of gaming that's been around for a very, very long time. And it stems from old guys with lots of little toy soldiers that want to find a way to play with the little toy soldiers.
Sure.
And I said that in a derogatory manner, and I shouldn't have, because I think it's really cool. I think it's a fun thing to play with.
Well, and there's an incredible amount of artistry that people put into creating the files, and also the printing and the painting of them is, stunning. Some of them.
That's an understatement.
Yeah.
That's an understatement.
Because
the artistic value that we're seeing is absolutely mind-boggling. And, to be able to paint them is kind of mind-boggling too. And from what I understand, that's part of it. It's you buy a game. Let's say you go and you buy a starter kit for Warhammer, and you're going to get like models, like old style ABS models. You'll get it in a sprue or that big square thing with the parts with the sprues, and you pop them off with the razor and you clean them and fit them together, and you glue them together with Tester's glue, and then after you've glued them together, you paint them just like we did with the old models that we used to buy when we were kids.
Yeah, back in my day, they were made out of lead.
Really?
No, probably not. Actually, they were probably lead-free by then. But my
ABS. It was ABS.
Oh, you're talking, well, there was the miniatures,
Polyethylene.
Well, I was thinking of the Dungeons and Dragons miniatures, which were were actually metal.
I'm thinking of the Aurora Superman model.
Okay, so
the
like
Batman
Mattel.
model. Not Mattel, Aurora.
What was the Aurora? Was the
that
company?
was the company.
Okay,
yeah.
I was thinking of there was another one that
All
anyways.
the DC characters, all the Marvel characters.
Yeah.
There were ships,
the ones you glued
famous
together,
ships, and you got these parts.
Yeah,
so
those were plastic.
Yeah, these games, these tabletop games. Tabletop is the name of it, but they're really not tables. They're too big to be on a table. But these games, when you buy them, they come with pre-injection molded parts that you put together and you paint, and that's part of the experience.
Sure.
The allure of putting the little models together. Now, in our world, we don't do that. We pour the resin into the vat and push a couple of touchscreens buttons and get out of the garage and open up the garage windows and
don't breathe.
And we print them. And we print them in a level of quality and detail that goes way beyond what the injected molded stuff can do.
Yeah.
So I've looked a little bit into this market, and the price ranges for pre-printed resin objects is anywhere from $30 to $200. $30 to $200, depending upon their size, of course.
Yeah.
And they don't come painted. If you buy them painted, you're going to pay a lot more.
Sure.
And when they're painted, they're usually painted by someone who really knows how to paint. So they are gorgeous. And you got to wonder, are you really going to play with that? You don't want to chip the paint. I mean, you really
be gentle with it.
Looks kind of valuable.
No one can actually swing a sword at it. So.
And the games are kind of fun. They're basically dice-based games. So we'll probably be looking at this more. But the reason I'm bringing it up is if you've ever been to My Mini Factory, go to the Tribes button, and you will see there is a relatively large number of people building their own sculptures in Blender and in Paintbrush and a bunch of other tools and selling them on My Mini Factory. I've got some research to do because I'm trying to figure out if you were to join one of these tribes and buy a set, I assume you're going to get a bunch of files that you print. What I don't understand yet, and we're going to find out about it, is how do you then associate each of these characters that you're going to print with what they call the codex of the game? Where is the codex for a game? Are you going to replace these parts with parts that came with the game, or is there a book about that game? I've gone into the Tribes links, and there's no information at all about what each character's specs are.
Well, I get a sense that this goes far beyond sort of the commercial tabletop games, and people are doing their own thing, because you can see so many. I mean, there's some that are like these bizarre, like post-apocalyptic worlds populated by like orcs. Yeah. I mean, there's all kinds of like really interesting creativity going on here.
There's steampunk robots. There's some that are sexually based fantasy stuff. There's all sorts of crazy, amazing designs. But what there isn't are the books that say, here's how you play.
Sure. Well, I'm sure if you dig deep enough in there, you'll find that.
We're going to find out, and we'll probably be talking about them more on this show. But, when you're looking at the different markets that use this business model, this market, which seems to be mostly on My Mini Factory, is one of the largest by far, and it's very interesting.
Yeah, and there's a lot of this sort of thing on Thingiverse as well, not as well organized, and most of the stuff you see on Thingiverse is sort of teasers by somebody who's made like a large collection of these things and are giving one away to kind of lure you to their site where you can buy the rest of them if you're really that interested.
Yeah, and it's not just the little figures, it's also the architectures, the houses, the forts, the panels that make up the floors that you play on. the whole thing you can 3D print, and you can do it in FDM, but if you're going to do the little characters, you're going to have to go 0.1 millimeter layer height or lower.
Yeah.
To get that detail.
STL is a better material for this, just because you don't really care about how strong they are. You care about how SLA rather. Yeah. You care about how detailed they are. But yeah, it's amazing the amount of creativity, and I kind of look at some of these worlds they've created, and like, why are you wasting your time doing this? Why aren't you making animated movies or something that I got interested in doing?
Well, we could talk about that, but that's a different skill set to do CGI, CG movies.
Right.
And by the way, there's another website that we have talked about quite a bit on this show that's also part of this market, and that's Hero Forge. Hero Forge, you can actually develop your own character interactively and then download an STL or have them printed for you and send it to you. I've had folks come to our shop before we closed it where we were 3D printing in FDM their figures, and it came out okay. The people that buy them were fine with the level of quality that they got. So you don't have to do this with SLA. You can do it with FDM. It just won't be as stunningly perfect.
Nice.
Yeah. Oh boy, Whitney, another show written to the hard drive, waiting for encoding, uploading, and commitment on our feed to all of our very supportive listeners. Thank you all out there for your support on Patreon. Thank you for your positive reviews. We really appreciate those. And thanks for listening. We do it for you. We do it for fun, non-profit here. We just do this because we got nothing better to do, I guess. So it's your thing of the week this week, Whitney.
Yeah, this is really cute. If you have a friend who is a hardcore tea drinker, or somebody who really cares about their product, because I know a lot of people they throw a tea bag in and call it good, and actually I even you see people drinking tea with the tea bag still in it sometimes.
Not a good thing to do.
Well,
I've done that, and it gets bitter.
You extract all the tannins and stuff out of the leaves eventually. So if somebody who cares about their tea, of course, if they care about their tea, they're probably not drinking tea bags anyway. But anyway, this is a neat little thing. It's called the T-Bot Automatic Tea Maker, and basically what it is it's a little robot arm with an alligator clip on it. And when you make your tea, you clip the alligator clip onto your tea bag, and you push a button, and it starts a timer for whatever time you want. And then when you decide that your tea is done steeping, then the robot arm extends and it lifts your tea bag out of the tea.
You made this derogatory comment about tea bags, and that's just not fair. I mean, you could put the tea in one of those little balls.
You could.
And you can drop it in with this
That's
one
true.
of those.
You could do that if you were serious about your tea. I'm not a serious tea drinker myself, but I know people who are. So, anyways, thing number 5250153, and it comes to us from Thingiverse user Snake P, and I like his face. It's Kurt Russell from Escape from New York.
Yeah, what was his name in the movie?
I think he was called Snake in the movie. So anyway, better known as Klaus Baumann from Bavaria.
Oh, wow, pretty cool. And if you've got a tip, a question, or a candidate thing of the week, what are you waiting for? Send us an email.
Send it to info@3dprintingtoday.com. That's THREE, the letter D, printingtoday.com.
We also invite you to join our forum on Google Groups. Go to Google and search 3D printing tips and tricks. And if you want to post, you hit the join button. It's totally free. We also still have our Facebook page or group on Facebook. Just search 3D Printing Today, number 3 in the letter D, and 3 separate words, 3D Printing Today podcast. We recommend the forum. Facebook has issues that are not, in my opinion, optimal for the kind of discourse and discussions that we have in 3D printing.
Yeah, Facebook is a good place for sort of entertainment, but if you ever go back and try and find something that somebody posted on Facebook, it's just not a feature of the platform.
Right.
So.
Whereas our forum on Google Groups, it's not perfect either, but it's more like an old-fashioned bulletin board system. The threads are well labeled and they don't collapse in multiple levels, so you lose every 3 or 4 replies get lost because they're all collapsed. Instead, you open them up and they're all there. And it's also managed by me.
Sure. And the purpose of the forum is to get information and to share information about 3D printing. It's not to throw something new into your face to prolong your engagement with the platform.
Right. Or to show off, look what I printed today.
Right.
Well, I guess you could do that.
It's if it's an interesting thing that you printed, okay, why not? But it's not, we're not trying to extract your personal information.
No. Not at all.
And as much of your eyeball time as we can get. We just want to help.
So we do have a show next week.
We do. Show number 426. We start out talking about printing PLA mixed with stainless steel.
We discuss cheap nozzles. I'll probably retract the discussion of the cheap nozzles, by the way, just up front ahead of time. Never mind. We'll get into it the next time.
Okay. And then we'll talk about a nimble fail.
Oh, painful. I guess that's it.
Great. Thanks for listening.